Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey. On this show, we will be exploring the issues faced by men and boys everywhere. We will be sharing our perspectives and your own. Your host, Erin Pizzey, was born in 1939 in China while her father was stationed there as a member of the British Foreign Office. In 1971, Erin opened the first ever domestic violence refuge for battered women and children in Chiswick, England. What she found, however, was that many of the women coming into her shelter were as violent as the men they were fleeing. Over the years, she also tried to create resources and safe spaces for men as well as women, but frequently met with indifference and hostility to men suffering. Nevertheless, it's a passion she continues to hold to this day for men, for women, and especially for children.
For so many years, feminists have been able to demonize men under their artificial argument called patriarchy. Hi, I'm Erin Pizzey, and through working with battered women in my refuges, I saw for myself how family violence is passed on from one generation to the next. Quite simply, violent behavior experienced in childhood is often carried forward into adult relationships. Family violence is not a gender issue and never was. It's a generational issue. To my amazement, nobody ever wanted to hear why violent people treat each other the way they do. Instead, feminists have had people believe that men are responsible for all the violence in our society. There is sufficient evidence that both men and women can be equally violent in their personal relationships, but for many years men and boys have been held to ransom and have been made to live in the knowledge that they are dispensable and shamed. There is an enormous job ahead of us, but my hope is that the 21st century will see men and women standing shoulder to shoulder and working together to actively take on the feminists and to show everyone that domestic violence is not and never has been a gender issue.
The truth is that men and boys are not privileged in our society, but are often marginalised, disadvantaged and ignored. We will be inviting you to call in and discuss your views and your experiences. Anyone of any age, sex, sexual orientation or religious background is invited to call in and talk. We may not get to everyone, but we will do our best within the show's allotted time. If you do wish to call in to share your own experiences, you will probably want to keep things on a first-name basis. You may wish to use a pseudonym for yourself or family members so that there's no concern about privacy. Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey and her co-host, Dean Esme. The truth is often painful to hear, but in truth, there is hope, and we hope you will stick around to hear it.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome everybody to the January 4th, 2014 episode of Revelations with Erin Pizzey. I am Dean Esme, Erin's co-host. This is our first show of the year, Erin. How are you?
Hello. I'm fine. I'm sitting here in California, the lovely blue sunshine.
Excellent. Now, I understand that you are also, you're in California now, but you're heading back to London in the next week or so, eh?
Alas, on Friday I shall be heading back to freezing cold grey London, but I love it anyway, so I'll be glad to be back.
I'd have to say it's not the best planning to go back to London in January, but...
I know, but I've had a wonderful Christmas with my family.
Well, that's the important thing. I had a pretty good Christmas, too.
Good.
We have a special show today. We've been honored with a special guest, Professor Murray Straus. Professor Straus is Professor of Sociology at the University of New Hampshire. I don't know how long he's been a full professor. I do know that he started in sociology in the 1950s. And he founded and is current co-chair of the Family Research Laboratory at the University of New Hampshire, I'll go ahead and introduce him. Professor Pearson, are you with us? I'm sorry, Professor Straus, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Very glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. How long have you been running the Family Research Lab there in the University of New Hampshire?
In 1974.
1974. What got you interested in investigating the family violence issue back then?
I remember the exact day because I was teaching a class on the family. And there was nothing in the syllabus, nothing in any lecture I planned about violence. We were at the section of the course on parent-child relationships. And in the course of the class discussion, one of the students mentioned an incident when she was a high school senior, and she came home from a date much later than agreed on. And her mother got angry and slapped her. And I, in my ignorance at the time, said, well, that was pretty unfortunate, but that's a very unusual event, hitting a teenager like that. And as soon as I said that, 2 or 3 hands went up in the class, and other students mentioned the same, not that same incident, but instances in which their parents had hit them when they were seniors in high school. So I thought, well, that's just a fluke of these few students. I asked the students to take out a piece of paper and write down just the answer to the question, did this happen to you when you were a high school senior? 24% said that they'd been hit when they were high school seniors.
Just when they were high school seniors?
Well, then later on I asked, what happened to you? And that was, 95 or 96%, mostly when they were little kids. But I still didn't believe it, so I asked a couple of colleagues to ask the same question in their class, and they got the same sort of results. So that got me started on research on family violence. And it wasn't long before I discovered that among the consequences, among the effects, hitting a dating partner. And so I've been at it ever since that day in 1969.
Oh, 1969. Wow.
Yeah.
And that one question, I mean, that's a very limited question, as we now know, right? I mean, how many of you were hit when you were in high school? Wow, 24%. But once that appears, because I've looked at your list of publications. You've got literally hundreds of peer-reviewed papers at this point, I think, and boy, it goes a lot deeper than just getting hit in high school, doesn't it?
It starts actually once I get into really researching it, not just students that happen to be in my class that would tell me about things. I found in a nationally representative sample of American parents that 30% hit infants, children under 1. And in the UK, the figure is higher. So this is something that starts virtually at birth.
Now, your current book, I just wanted to make sure to mention it before we get into more serious questions. I want everybody in the audience to know that Professor Straus's current book is called The Primordial Violence. The Primordial Violence by Murray Straus, S-T-R-A-U-S. That's with Routledge. Routledge is the publisher. He has a few other books out there that you can look up, and of course he has his website at the University of New Hampshire. If you just Google his name, you'll find a copious list of publications. I also read that this year, on July 13th through 15th, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, you're going to be part of something called the 2014 International Family Violence Research Conference. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, That's a conference that we've been holding for researchers. I've forgotten just when, but it's probably the first one must have been around 1980. And we hold it every year, every second year. And it's the main distinction between that and many other conferences on family violence is that this one is focused on researchers. So it's not intended for the general public, though they're very welcome if they can put up with chi-square statistics and things like that. It's intended as a scientific society meeting, and it's been very successful. Whole books have been published based on the papers presented at this conference over the years, and many, many journal articles. So it was an important crystallizing and catalyzing element in the development of the field of research on family violence.
Professor Straus, can I get you to get a little closer to the mic or speak up just a little bit? We can hear you.
Sure, no problem.
That's better. Now, when did you and Professor Straus meet the first time?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, Professor Straus, it was a very, very important meeting in my life because I'd been struggling in England at this first refuge in the world in 1971, and nobody was listening, and everybody who did get involved were essentially extremely destructive. As far as the Church of England was concerned, I was a marriage wrecker. And as far as the establishment in England was concerned, it wasn't really a problem. I was making it a problem. So I think, Professor Straus, we met somewhere 1974, 75. And is that right?
I've forgotten the date when we first met. It must have been around then. But
yeah, because there was you, Richard Gellis, and I think Susan Steinmetz was there, but I didn't spend much time with her. And I remember just looking at all three of you when you were just beginning your in-depth research into domestic violence between men and women at that time. And it was such a relief to talk to three people who actually understood what I was talking about. There were three of us from England, and we were doing Eastern Seaboard to help set up refuges.
Yes. Yeah, even before we met, when I wrote the introduction to Richard Gellis's book, The Violent Home, I mentioned your work in establishing the first refuge and the importance of it, not just for aiding those particular women, important as it was, but in establishing the prevalence of this problem and the need to do something about it.
And I remember particularly at that time my concerns, because I had seen what was happening to us in England with the split coming in 74 actually, between what I believe to be true, which is family violence is generational, and the feminist concept that domestic violence is gendered, that it's the result of patriarchy. And I could see the damage that was going to be done if this concept of domestic violence was prevalent, which in fact it did become prevalent. It became actually across the Western world, how people perceive domestic violence. And the tragedy for me is so many millions and billions of dollars have gone into this concept, whereas what we really need to look at, and that should have from the very, very beginning, is the effects on domestic violence on children as they are born, like I was, into one of these dysfunctional and violent families.
That reminds me that I want to establish something. I know we're regularly getting more and more listeners, many people very skeptical of what we're saying, which is one of the reasons we do this show. And Professor Straus, at least on the issue of domestic violence, you would agree, would you not, that women and men are about equally violent in domestic relationships. Is that right?
Yes, if you take the definition of violence as physically attacking, what in legal terms is called an assault, then they're approximately equal. And for young women, actually, the rate is higher of women assaulting a partner than for men, slightly higher. But generally, across the board and across many nations, it's about the same. If you take as the definition a physical attack, if you take this definition as injury, then on average, study after study shows that on average, women are injured more often than men and more seriously. Now, that's average. There's, of course, many, many exceptions. And one does not contradict the other. Critics of my research point this out as though it contradicted the fact that women assault as often as it does not. It just adds, it importantly adds a dimension that also has to be considered, namely who comes out on the short end of things, and women more often than men do.
That's an interesting way of putting it, although I think some would argue with you that if a woman starts hitting and then gets hit back, there's a complexity there, even to whether or not she got injured in the first place. But that aside, I want to mention that we now have on the line with us Allison Tiemann, a senior editor at A Voice for Men and also the host of Honey Badger Radio. Good morning, Allison. It's morning where you are, isn't it?
It's actually getting to afternoon. I apologize for my voice. I'm dealing with a bit of a flu right now, so it's got a burr in it. Just so I can to say a little bit of Honey Badger Radio, I am the host of Honey Badger Radio, but I have three co-hosts, Della Burton, Diana Davidson, and Karen Strawn, otherwise known as Girl Writes What, very famous men's rights YouTuber. And you can catch us on Thursdays at, that would be 8 p.m. Central. And so that's me. And I actually did have something to say to Mr. Straus about his conclusion that women are more likely to be seriously injured. I'd like to point out that studies have shown that psychological injury can be just as severe with psychological violence as, the psychological effects of verbal violence, the long-term psychological effects of verbal violence can be just as severe, or is just as severe as physical violence. So it seems like a sort of a fine point to say that, well, let's count bruises and see who's worse off.
Yeah, in fact, probably even longer lasting. That at least is what my research on psychological violence shows. It does show.
What would you say the effects of this psychological violence, how do they manifest?
Well, they manifest itself, the aspect of it that I studied was depression and anxiety. And being assaulted by a partner increases the probability of depression and anxiety. Now, it does it for both men and women. Men are attacked by their partners. And remember, we have to go back to just as many men are attacked by their partners as women. When men are attacked, it also increases the probability of depression and anxiety, but not as much.
Really?
I think that's because women are more invested on average in relationships. So when something that undermines and attacks a relationship hurts them more. But because it's somewhat more harmful to women, doesn't mean it's not harmful to men. Just like physical attacks, women may be injured more often, but lots of men are injured. We don't say, well, the disease B isn't worth studying because disease A is more harmful. We've got to attend to both.
If I could just interject here, I find it astounding that you're asserting that men are less invested in relationships than women, considering that when relationship breakup that's when men's suicide skyrockets and their depression. Well, I mean, and I'd also point out that when you're talking about a group of people whose social role is to downplay their harm, like their sense of vulnerability, I mean, don't you have to sort of account for the fact that men are trained to man up and not admit to issues and problems?
Yeah, there are lots of different circumstances, but what the empirical research shows, that on average, women have more invested in relationships than men. Average can be very misleading because no one is average. There's always people above the average and below. And so you have to take into account each case.
Well, we do know from research that in the wake of divorce in particular, men are literally about 10 times as likely to suicide successfully as women are. So I'm curious as to what your averages, what the averages you refer to are measuring, because obviously suicide isn't the only thing you would measure, but men suiciding after a breakup is much more common than women. So I think I'm curious, where would these men must have been invested in something.
Not up on the research on suicide.
Well, I think if I may say something.
What?
Can I actually interject here?
Well, of course, it's your show, Erin.
What I would say, and I take Alison's point, but I would actually say when a breakup occurs for men, and this is from my observations of many, many suicides, obviously, in the work I've done, particularly as the women and the children were in the refuge. First of all, one of the reasons for the suicide, certainly, is there are no provisions for men. There are no refuges for men. There's nowhere for men to go. And men tend to invest themselves almost totally in their relationship with their family, the wife and the children, and their home. Whereas women have a much, much wider, I think, Murray, you're absolutely, a much wider circle of invested relationships. So when the breakup occurs, for men, they are completely isolated, because one of the problems for the men is they do not get together when they are in trouble and are feeling weak. One of the problems for men is they're very heavily judged by each other. So my feeling is that one of the first things that we have to do is to make provision for men, because nowhere in the Western world has it yet happened that man's role in domestic violence as a victim is properly recognized. Would you think that's true, Murray?
Yes, I agree with that. In this country, when a man calls the domestic violence hotline, he's most likely to get referred to a treatment program for men who assault, for battery.
That's disgusting.
It's just, it's horrible. So we urgently need that. And to get back to the main point, the issue isn't which one is hurt more. The issue that we agree on is that they are both hurt, and we need to do something about that. If one is hurt less than the other, doesn't mean we should pay less attention to that. But the fact that both are hurt is what we need to attend to.
And also, I think we need to attend to the concept of, if both adults are hurting each other, what on earth are they doing to the children? Because many of the people I deal with say, oh, well, the children weren't involved. Oh, yes, they were.
Yes.
What do you mean by that? You mean children witnessing it or experiencing it?
Or hearing it. I mean, one of the things that I can tell you is that my childhood, with the three of us, consisted of sitting in our beds, or me sitting at the top of the stair, listening to the parents fighting and actually being absolutely terrified. And we didn't go downstairs because there wasn't anything we could do. But for children, that's the reality of the situation. Children, and we are the next generation of potentially violent and dysfunctional people. And I think that's been lost in all the politics of this movement.
Yeah, it's not only lost, to a certain extent it's frowned upon or forbidden. I reviewed the research on children being exposed to violence between the parents, and almost all of it only investigates whether the mother has been assaulted by the father. They don't into whether the mother also engaged in violence against the father, which is the typical thing. In my research, about half the cases of children exposed to violence between the parents, both parents were doing it, and in the remaining half, 1/4 of the cases were only the mother. That's ignored in the research and in the treatment programs. In fact, social workers get reprimanded if not always, but frequently get reprimanded if they say, well, we have to pay attention to violence by the mother, not just the father.
And that's rather horrifying because there's plenty of statistical data to suggest that women actually may be more likely there's substantial data to suggest that they're as likely to hit children, and there's evidence that they're more likely to hit children than their fathers are. And that's not an anti-mother thing. It's just there's a lot of research on that. I can point people to papers on it and studies on it. The notion that you wouldn't ask the question is just mind-boggling. Well, hell, even if women were only half as likely to hit children as men, you'd still have to ask the question, for goodness sakes, but we know this isn't true. One of the things I want to go back to, I don't want to harp on this for an entire show, but I want to get some clarification on a point you made a little earlier. Again, this thing that women are more invested in their relationships than men. I'm curious, what metric are you using on that? I mean, is it like, well, they have more invested while the relationship is... what did you mean by it? What metric are you using for that?
I haven't myself done research. I'm only basing that on research by others that I know about, and basing it on the fact that women are more dependent on the relationship, for example, economically, especially if they have children. So a threat to the relationship is an economic threat to women to a much greater extent than men. But I think we're talking about the wrong point. The point is not whether women are hurt more than men. It's that both are hurt, and we need to attend to both, and we need to stop the violence by women as well as by men.
Well, yes, especially in today's no-fault divorce climate, the woman's economic dependency could change, and these things are always complex. So the bottom line is, I think we would all here agree, it's a serious problem, and we should stop treating it like fundamentally a gendered issue, right?
That's right.
Yeah, but then the question becomes, why is there so much research into trying to make it women the bigger victim? Like, why investigate? Like, why not just say, okay, well, this obviously is going to have negative effects on it. Why investigate that these negative effects are going to be larger for women than men? Why not just say, well, this is violence. We need to stop it.
Well, because I would say, Alison, there's a huge money problem behind all this. That all the money has been invested, and women as victims has been established for the last 40 years. So all the programs that are funded, all the teaching that's funded, all the agencies, all the judiciary are all based on the fact that women are innocent victims of men's violence. And that has been the political ideology for the 40 years. And it's only people like Murray Straus and Richard Gellis and Susan Steinmetz, who unfortunately are dead, who have been doing this research to finally prove what most of us working in the field have known all along, that it is generational. It's a complete waste of time, but it had to be done, all this research, to actually prove that violence is generational because at the moment the general public and everyone else, and above all, the people who actually are supposed to look after victims of both men, women and children, have only been concentrating on women. And all along, it is the children that matter, because generational violence is from one generation to another. And if we could only establish that we need to work on the generational violence, we could actually empty our prisons and our mental hospitals, because the majority of people who are in there are battered and abused and sexually abused children originally.
That gets to something that... Oh, go ahead, Professor.
Actually, I think it was me that was talking. I guess my cold is making me sound really low. Well, just to speak to what you said, Erin, yeah, you're exactly right. I bet if you took men and women and children and found out who was hurt by a wide margin.
I'm sorry, you broke up there, Allison. Can you repeat that? You broke up for a minute there.
I said if you actually take men and women and children and include children in this and decide which group of people is hurt most, children would be hurt by a wide margin. So it seems like it's this back and forth about which is hurt more, men or women, is almost like ignoring the elephant in the room.
I agree. But the question is, how are you going to break down 40 years of what has been a massive lie and financially, as far as I'm concerned, a huge fraud?
I know that prior to the show, Professor, we spoke, and you actually mentioned you want to go into this question. What causes this? What causes this prevailing myth? And I think we can say scientifically it's established. This is a myth that domestic violence is something men do to women. I think you would agree. What causes this prevailing myth?
Yeah, I mean, if I get a bit academic, but it's not a myth that men hit women. They do, but women do it. The myth is that it's only men who do it. A lot of men do it. Worldwide, a lot of men hit. My view of the results of the research is that there are multiple reasons. Anyone who focuses on any one of those and suggests or implies that that is the cause is wrong, no matter what the cause is, because this has multiple causes. And we don't get anywhere by denying any one of them. If you're an advocate, if you're running some program, of course you have to emphasize the aspect of it that you're working on. But it's always only one. This is a multiply caused thing. And let's just take patriarchy and male dominance. The research is overwhelming that the more male dominant the society, the more male dominant the relationship, the more likely there is to be an assault. But the research is also overwhelmingly clear that that's only one of many causes, and not even the most important cause, important as it is, like each of them are important. Just take one of my studies, which is of who's dominant in the relationship.
I'll ask you to speak up a little again, Professor, sorry.
Well, if you take one of my studies about dominance in the relationship and its relationship to violence, it shows clearly that the more male dominant, the more violence. But it shows just as clearly that the more female dominant, the more violence. And this is whether it's reported by male study participants or female, or whether the measure of dominance is based on the United Nations Gender Inequality Index. I mean, it's the fundamental problem underlying the relationship between patriarchy and male dominance in a relationship and violence is inequality. Any kind of inequality breeds violence.
Okay, so wait a minute. You're suggesting that in cultures that are quote unquote male dominated, men are more likely to hit women than the reverse?
That's right. Many studies.
Many studies have shown this?
Yes.
And we don't think it's men underreporting or ashamed to report it?
This is as reported by women as well as by men.
Okay. How big would you say the divergence is in general then?
It's very large. The more male dominant the society, the higher the rate of assault. It's 3 or 4 times greater than comparing Sweden with Iran, for example. It's about 4 or 5 times greater. Sweden being, according to the United Nations Gender Inequality Index, the most gender equal of the more than 100 nations for which this data is available, and Iran, one of the most male dominant. So it's much higher.
If I could
Iran, it's step by step. More male dominant, the more violence by men. But what the United Nations, what the World Health Organization studies, which one of many studies that show this, that's also true for violence by women. The more male dominant the society, the more violence by women and everyone else. Male dominance is criminogenic. It creates violence. It creates crime, including partner violence.
Allison, you had a point you wanted to make or a question you wanted to ask?
Yeah, well, I'd like to make a point about the Middle East. From the studies that I've seen to sexual violence of boys, it's epidemic there. I've seen studies that indicate that it's epidemic in India, South Africa, and also the Middle East. That I think something like 2 out of 5, or was it 3 out of 5 boys in South Africa said that they were sexually abused. I mean, going back to Erin's point, perhaps the violence is in the so-called male-dominated societies is spawned by the fact that they're treating their boys very appallingly, and not just sexual violence, but also the expectation that these boys treat themselves as expendable soldiers in these ideological wars. When you create a group of people and you tell them that their role is violence and to be expendable in the service of their societies, don't be surprised that that's what you get. But I wouldn't say that that's at all beneficial to the men in those societies, the men and boys in those societies.
Yes, I agree with what you're saying. The general principle, and this is shown by excellent research, is that the more male-dominant the society, the more violence of all kinds, including partner violence, but not restricted to that. The higher the homicide rate, the higher the assault rate in general of other men, the higher the suicide rate, the higher the fatal accident rate. You name the measure of violence. It occurs when the society is male dominant. More of it occurs.
But I think the point Allison might be trying to point to, although I don't know if we can back this up with research, is that if you structured society around using men in the role of enforcer and soldier and everything else, you're essentially training that violence into them. You're training everybody to violence, I suppose, but is that basically the point you're trying to make, Allison, or badly?
Well, the point I'm trying to make is that in these societies, men are treated as expendable. Now, you can call that male dominance, but I think that's the ultimate experience of powerlessness. And you can also point that in these societies, in these so-called male-dominant societies, women have complete dominance over the home. And this is a very cultural facet of their culture, is that when you enter the threshold of the home, women are dominant, and women are the ones raising children. So I think that it's looking at it in terms of male dominance puts an excessive amount of emphasis on male agency when the reality is, if you marginalize men from raising children, boys grow up feeling like they're expendable because they don't have that strong sense of a masculine identity. So they have to feel like they have to expend themselves in earning one. And what the end result of that is a violent society, and all these young men competing to earn a masculine identity. And calling that male-dominated, I think it's an unnecessary implication of men. I think it's a system that comes out of harsh environments, as opposed to something that men have chosen to set up. Especially considering on a lot of different metrics, they're the ones losing out.
Yeah, everyone loses out in that kind of society.
Well, I would say that everyone does lose out, yes, but how much of that is poverty and lack of resources, and needing to have a group of people to be able to go out and get those resources for you, to expend themselves in service of protecting you from other people who want to get your resources, and also expend themselves in getting those resources. But this is far off topic, and I apologize. Digression. Throwing it back to you, Dean.
But it sort of goes back to I was just thinking as I was listening, Alison. Yeah, I mean, certainly. And I opened a refuge about 10 years ago in Bahrain. It was the first in the Arab world and much needed. And the most important thing, as far as just thinking about it, I spent 6 years in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I was at a born-again church which had many virtues, I have to say, but the one outstanding feature, and of so many of these churches that I have been to across the world, whether it's one in a Caribbean island or whatever, what was very obvious, the violence in the church, because it was spare the rod and spoil the child. And children, and according to the church elders, both men and women, children should be whipped and beaten, because if they did not comply, they had to have the devil beaten out of them. Now that's within our own countries. And if that's the prevailing attitude in a very huge amount of families, we have to think about it. Because as we go back to the beginning of talking with Murray saying, the young students in his class were being hit as children, as very young children, and as teenagers. The hitting habit, as I call it. And it is a habit, and it is one that for a very long time has been sanctioned. I mean, it's only recently we've stopped beating children in public schools. It was boys that got beaten, not girls. So I think we're on a crest of an enormously important move to where we recognize that hitting habit actually brain damages, and now with the MRI scans they can look at the brains of young violent children and actually see where the damage lies. And knowing that now, there's absolutely no excuses for domestic violence.
I'll tell you, one of the things that I've seen in some of these male-dominated environments does repeat something you just said. In a lot of these societies, this even matches things I've seen. Hitting boys is considered more okay than hitting girls is.
Yes.
And whipping boys is considered more acceptable than whipping girls is. I don't know how that looks globally, but it's certainly something I've seen. But I think this does go back to a point you've made, Professor. Ultimately, this all is a generational problem, wouldn't you say?
It is a generational problem. That's extremely important. But one has to understand the mechanisms by which things get transmitted from one generation to the other. And of course, as Erin has just pointed out, one of the mechanisms is hitting children. They have the example. Not only is it an example, but it's a demonstration that it's morally correct to hit. Parents, very few parents, simply walk up to a child and hit him. The child has to be doing something wrong, and usually persisting in it. So what's the lesson learned? If someone is doing wrong and persisting in it, it's morally okay to hit them. Well, that's the situation of most partner violence. Sooner or later, all partners misbehave, at least as the other partner sees it. And this kind of learning, it increases the probability of their assaulting the partner for their partner's misbehavior, either to correct it or as in retribution. So that's extremely important. But it's only one of many things that is important. And just to mention some of the long list of other things, which I want to repeat as many times as I can, that any attempt to imply that one thing explains them is by itself makes it likely to be a mistake. Just to mention some of the many things. One of them is low self-control. Another is a drinking problem. Another is stress. The list goes on and on of well-established things, scientifically established things that are been proven and are ignored. The World Health Organization published a list of 16 well-established risk factors like this for partner violence. They completely ignore it. Even though they themselves published this list, they focus on just one, namely patriarchy. That's correct, but a big error because that's only one of many, many things.
We have a caller on the line who's been waiting patiently. Gunther, I know he has some very specific questions, and he told James in the back room that he's read a number of your papers. Gunther, are you on the line with us?
Yeah, hi, Dean. Hello, Erin, and hi, Dr. Straus. I'm very happy that this show is happening, and I've been waiting for this to be able to speak with you. I read most of your papers, especially the recent ones in defense of the CTS, which is, when you look at this domestic violence subject on Wikipedia, for example, there's so much nonsense being touted about the shortcomings of the CTS and stuff like this. But it's very nice to read your latest paper. I think it came out only this year, in 2013 or so,
Gunther,
which has responded.
Gunther?
Yes. Yes.
Twice, 2 or 3 times now, you've referenced something called CTS. Could you tell us what that is, please?
The CTS, the conflict tactics scale, that is Dr. Straus's most important invention, really, that all the domestic violence researchers, even the ideologues, are using in one form or the other to gather any data about the subject. So that's extremely important to know.
Yes, I should add.
So is that helpful?
I just wanted to make sure people knew what you were talking about while you were asking your questions. So I'm sorry.
Okay. Now, to not talk too long, I have really three areas of questions. One, Dean, maybe you can take that near the end of the show to ask Dr. Straus about what the next steps are in his research and what sort of even help might be needed in order to establish the truth and find solutions to the problem. The second subject that I wanted to address is to look at, to perhaps propose a new perspective on how we talk about domestic violence, especially in the men's movement, but in general in society. I hear a lot of talk about victims, survivors, shelters, and punitive measures. But I wonder whether that really looks at the low-hanging fruit of those items that we actually can address. Because when you look at Dr. Straus's and all his colleagues' research, it comes pretty much down to this. In the West, you have about 1/4 of the population exposed to domestic violence, 25%, of which it's always been shown 60% is neutral. And then the remaining 40% of that makes about 10% of the total violence is unidirectional. And those are these more severe cases, of which 5% committed by total 5% of population, the men being violent, total 5% of the population, the women. Now, these 5% might actually correlate very well with the prevalence of personality disorders, narcissistic personality disorders, borderline, and so forth. So if we assume that these very, very harsh cases, these awful cases we always hear about, this battered women syndrome, or the opposite side on the man's end, those do exist, and those are horrible. But they typically are a pairing of personality disordered aggressor and codependent victim, where the solution really is for the victim to simply understand that they're being victimized and get out of the relationship. And yes, a shelter can help, but really all of that does not address the 60% of the mutual cases, which are, as I personally have actually experienced at least once or in a short episode. Those cases seem to be a couple of that really love each other, and that are just frustrated with each other, and they don't know how to deal with their frustration and how to work things out. And so I'm wondering if we're not missing that extremely important large group of violence cases by shoehorning it all into this perpetrator-victim situation, rather than understanding that these are people who love each other, and these are families who should be rescued rather than destroyed by this ripping apart punitive approach that we have. And so then finally my question is whether Dr. Straus has investigated perhaps these very different etiologies of violence, and whether there is whether they are interventions, possible psychotherapy, relationships therapy interventions, which have proven themselves to actually really solve this majority of these family violence problems.
Okay, that was a whole lot, but if I was to distill it down to its essence, you'll look excited, it's okay. You're saying that the research seems to show, and I think Professor Straus will agree, the majority of violent relationships are in some way mutual or consensual, as Erin might put it. They're both being abusive to each other. And if I have the question right, are there therapeutic interventions that can save these relationships, or do they just need to be severed, period? What do you think? And I'd be curious what Erin thinks, too.
Well, let me say that the three questions, as I heard them, there are several aspects to each question, but let me just take them up in the order. The first one was about the CTS, and I won't say much about that. The CTS, the instrument used in more than half of quantitative research on domestic violence, has been demonstrated to be valid and reliable over and over and over again in many countries. But it's and that's why it's used so widely, even as this caller pointed out, by people who are ideologues and deny the results. It has an ironic aspect. Because the CTS is the dominant instrument, it's used by most of the studies, it provides the best means of denying the validity of those findings about equal rates of assault by men and women. People simply think it's sufficient to say that the CTS is invalid, misleading. Therefore, results can be denied. You read this over and over again. And the most frequent thing, they say it ignores context. It just counts the number of assaults. Well, it does count the number of assaults. That's its virtue. That's the hard behavior fact. But the problem of ignoring context is the research of those people who make the criticisms and don't attend to the context. The CTS doesn't just count number of assaults. That's one of the 4 of the 5 scales. It also measures injury. And people say it's ignoring this big context the difference in injury? Well, CTS provides a measure of that. They say it's ignoring the intransigence of the partner. CTS measures that. It's ignoring psychological aggression. No, it doesn't. There's a scale. So the guilt for ignoring context is on the critics of the CTS who failed to use its 4 or 5 scales. But ironically and unfortunately, it provides such a convenient method of denial by asserting that the CTS is invalid. It's done over and over again by people who simply don't want to accept, for ideological reasons, the fact that women assault as often as men. The next question, as I heard it, is what about the next steps treatment? And in particular, the caller mentioned personality disorders. Yes, personality disorders are one of the big causes, one of the big risk factors of assaults by both men and women. When men assault, it's not just because they want to be dominant. Some do. It's also because of many other things. There are many, many causes, and no one of treating any one of them is only going to give a small solution. So personality disorders is certainly one that's been demonstrated over and over again. For example, borderline personality. Many studies show that women with borderline personality disorder are more likely to hit their partner. Men with antisocial tendencies and criminal background are more likely to hit their partner. Now, what's the implication? The implication of this is that the so-called Duluth model of treatment is totally bankrupt. It's been demonstrated, even the U.S. Department of Justice, which spends millions of dollars every year supporting programs that claim to treat partner violence through this model, which is based on assuming that the cause is male dominance. Even the Department of Justice, in its review of literature, said that it has no demonstrable beneficial effect. So, but why do they continue to do it? To the point that many of you this afternoon have pointed out that it's an ideological commitment to male dominance and patriarchy as the cause. So that's what the Department of Justice in the U.S. follows that too. So we need to have a more multifaceted treatment program than the Duluth model. And in relation to the third point, the part of it that I heard, because this breaks up from time to time, on the interventions need to recognize the multiple causes. If your intervention is about drinking problems, that's going to take care of some of the cases, but not most of them. If your intervention is about male dominance, it's going to take care of some of the cases, but not most of it. If your intervention is about personality disorders, it's going to take care of some of the cases, but not most of them. No one can take care of most of them because there's so many. So there needs to be a system in which there is initial intake, diagnostic measurement, to find out what are the factors occurring in the cases being treated, and focus the treatment on whatever that diagnosis shows, not on some predetermined cause. And Erin, I hope you'll excuse me for this, that includes intergenerational transmission. There's many, many violent men and violent women who were not brought up in violent homes, and many who were, most in fact, who do not repeat the crime. That's true of every risk factor for almost any medical or social problem. Just to give you an example that everyone knows about, heavy smoking. we all know heavy smoking causes lung cancer and other diseases. A third of heavy smokers die of it. Well demonstrated epidemiological evidence. So that's very clear. That 1/3 makes it also clear that 2/3 do not die of it. And the same thing with those brought up in violent families. 2/3 of them don't do it. Now,
yeah, that's fascinating. You know, Murray, because I used to ask myself, I get a mother in with, say, 4 children,
and to
of
do
which,
it,
yeah,
the percent is much higher than those not brought up in violent families, but most do not.
So I think that's a good point. We've made it before, but you just actually gave me a number on this, that, okay, most people who grow up in violent environments do not become hitters. But it's a huge risk factor for it. Now, what were you going to say, Erin?
Oh, no, I'm just going to say to Murray, no, Murray, I absolutely agree with you. The thing that was so interesting to me was when the families came into the refuge, the mothers and the children, and we also saw most of the men. When the children came in, you could actually pinpoint very quickly which child or children were going to continue with the violence because they were already grossly disturbed as they came in. There are other factors that can create violence in children, which are outside influences from the family, say much later in life. But my argument always, along with both the mothers, the children, and the men, was simply this. If your strategy as a small child for survival was to lash out because you were lashed out at, then you have to learn an alternative way of coping with your life skills. And most of the work that I did with the mothers and the children was teaching them different life skills. And also when you work with both the men and the women, it's the same argument. It's if this is how you've learned to protect yourself and to keep yourself safe, what you have done is to recreate a dangerous lifestyle for yourselves. If you want to make changes with each other, then you have to change the way that you approach each other and take care of each other. And it is possible, and I had very long-term residential programs. They were all closed down because at that time it was the patriarchal argument. Therefore, it called for a massive revolution. And, you know all the political jargon that goes with that. But it's a human problem. And it is the great point of all this is, yes, it's better if the children come in very young to the influences that will help them unlearn most of what they have learned in terms of how to behave and socializing. But the brain is incredibly elastic and plastic, and whatever time you take a look at your life and realize that your attitude to life is aggressive, bombastic, and dangerous, you can change. This is what we should be doing.
Yes, I agree with that. If there's a general heading that covers what is probably the most frequent cause, it's inability to manage social relationships, including partnerships. So the treatment programs needs to have high priority, but it's not, like everything else, not the only thing.
No.
You had a pretty good, you were talking about the Duluth model and how it's completely invalid. I don't think anybody in this conversation is going to agree with you. It is worthless. I guess the question is, Erin, you spoke, have you had success with couples who were violent with each other, who as a couple were able to stop that and stay functional as a family unit?
Yes. I have had great success, but there again, as Murray says, it all depends, for me as far as I was concerned, on the levels of violence. If I'm talking about personality disorders, no. I can say honestly, where I have no right to diagnose anybody, where I have in front of me somebody with a very severe personality disorder, I hold my hands up and say there's not much I can do about that. But where you get couples who are actually what I call fighting couples, warring couples, because they know no other way except aggression, everybody will tell you who's in this field it's perfectly possible. And sometimes it's as simple as actually saying to both of them that, as far as I could see, the relationship is built on the violence. I often say to a couple, look, before we start, let me tell you something. If we make the changes that I think are necessary for you two to have a relationship, you might find at the end of this, you've come out as people who can make relationships, but probably not with each other, because the reason you've chosen each other are for it to meet your bad needs in each other. And often, ruefully, at the end of the work, what I've said will come true.
Allison, you had something you wanted to say or ask about?
Well, actually, I did have a couple of statements and then a question at the end. First of all, in terms of the context that the critics of the CST and the CST2 talk about, there was a study that looked into context on a wide scale. It was the Harvard Medical Study in 2007. It was somewhat limited because it interviewed people between the ages of 18 and 28. But its findings were that, excuse me, it's just my cough is a little bit, makes it difficult to talk sometimes. But the findings were that 70% of unilateral violence was female on male, with 30%, I believe, being male on female. And that mutual violence constituted 50% of all of the violent couples. So when you bring in the context, you still don't see what they're looking for, which is this patriarchal model, at least not in all of the couples. In fact, it's sort of a minimum of the couples are looking at a situation of male dominance. And another study, the Center of Disease Control's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Study, found that women engaged in more controlling violence. And I found that particular finding interesting because I've noticed that when you, and maybe Mr. Straus will have a comment on this, I've noticed that when you extend the window that you ask people to recall violent acts in, the number of men who recall violent acts goes down proportionately relative to women. So if you ask in the last 12 months, you get equality, you get pretty much parity. If you ask in the last five years, it goes down about 30% male victims. And then if you ask over a lifetime, it looks more like 20% male victims. And I've always found that interesting. And then finally, I had a question about Mr. Straus's assertion that people can pick up violent behaviors without having been in a violent situation. So you're saying that if a child is raised in a perfectly healthy family, they can go on to be violent?
Yes.
Is that?
That's correct. Because
and how does that is there
important as a family is in influencing the child's behavior, it's only one of many factors. For example, there are genetic differences well established by modern brain science and genetics. Genetic differences in propensity to violence. That's just a start. Then the family is not the only socializing influence. There are other people that can treat the child cruelly, treat the child humanely. Then there's the media. Millions of kids spend hours and hours practicing killing other people on video games. And even before video games, just ordinary novels and children's books. Violence is everywhere in most societies. So this is going to be a long road to change it, but it can change. I mean, the history of Sweden is a marvelous example. Sweden was a very bloodthirsty nation in the 1500s. Mothers in Poland, I was told, when Sweden conquered that part of Europe, mothers would keep their kids in line by saying, if you don't behave, I'm going to turn you over to the Swedes. They were noted for cruelty. And so what's happened to transform Sweden from a bloodthirsty nation to one of the most peaceful and equalitarian on earth? Many things. It's happened bit by bit. even in the 1950s, almost all parents in Sweden spanked their kids. Now it's less than 10%. So things can change. The history of Sweden is just one example. But the change is not very frequent. Sweden is marvelous, in a certain sense, exception. But the rest of the world is following, bit by bit.
I think it's, while I might challenge you a little on the whole idea that video games cause violence, perhaps that would be another show, but I think the overall point you make is probably very good, that there are influences outside the family. I've seen kids, for example, growing up in rough neighborhoods where maybe their parents didn't hit them, but kids hit each other a lot. I've seen that one in action. Of course, people who go off and experience the horrors of war may come back and develop a drinking problem and start lashing out. So I don't. It seems almost like a no-brainer to say family wouldn't be the only possible influence. Jump in if you disagree with me, but I don't think you do. We have another caller on the line who has been waiting patiently for about 40 minutes.
Wow.
Attila Vincer, welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey. How can we help you today, Attila?
Thank you, Dean. Hello, Erin. And Professor Straus, it is a distinct pleasure to be able to speak with you on the matter of domestic violence. I wanted to, first of all, make a couple of assertions, a couple of comments. Number one, I believe that where there actually is domestic violence in the home, it is the children who are most affected and most harmed, because children depend on the parents, on the adults, to keep them safe. And quite often they get caught in the crossfire. And it's very difficult for a child to witness a mother and a father who they both love very deeply be so violent with each other. And domestic violence is not always physical. Quite often it is mental. And also I'd like to add that you could have physical violence to the point of almost touching, but just an implied physical violence can be very traumatic mentally. The reason I know this is I have trained in martial arts for 38 years, and I know exactly the effects, both psychologically, because most of what martial arts is a mental art, meaning of the mind, not of the body. Further, it is unfortunate that men in society today are the ones who are wrongly made out to appear as the only people who are responsible for domestic violence. I'm not just saying this from the research that's out there, nor is it my personal opinion, but I like to get out into the trenches, as I like to say it, and I go into the courts where these cases are dealt with. And I've looked at many, many, many cases that are before the courts, and one of the problems is there are people who are making false allegations of domestic violence, and in fact, a process server, a female, had told me that in the past 10 years she has witnessed nearly every divorce case had some allegation of either domestic violence, sexual, or rape allegations. So, and this is coming from women. Women have learned that to make these allegations equals to immediate preference to having custody of a child, which equals to having status quo established, which will then equal to gaining access or gaining control of the matrimonial home, and the child support, spousal support that will flow from that. It is my view that research is neither complete nor fully accurate. I think we need to listen to the police officers, for example, that tell me they are mandated to arrest the male. And some of that matter that is recorded by the police is then flowing into some of this data that we are depending on, which today, if you ask anybody, they will say to you, well, men are the violent people and women are not. And Professor, as you had said, there's many different elements, and I'm looking forward to reading your material. But to finish off, I have two questions for you, Professor. I'd like to know why it is that we are not hearing in the judicial areas, in the domestic violence clinics. It is changing, I have to admit, but why is it that we are not accurately hearing what the actual reality of domestic violence conditions are, which is initiated roughly equally by men and women? And the second question I have is, what is the most harmful type of domestic violence?
Well, why aren't we hearing that? You can't hear about what you don't ask about. And family therapists now are trained for years and years, back in the 1980s, along with a colleague. I published an article showing that most family therapists don't know about the violence that their clients are experiencing. They're treating the relationship, and they simply didn't ask them about it. That's changed. Now they're instructed to ask women if they feel unsafe, if they've been assaulted. They're not trained to ask men as well. I was in the hospital not long ago, in which that's an exception. It's an exception, but in this particular hospital, I wasn't asked, and the nurse who asked me excused herself and said, "I know this isn't appropriate," or something like that, "but I have to ask it." So she was inviting a denial that, on my part, if I was a victim.
Well, Professor, if I could interrupt you just briefly, I know it's anecdotal, but of course the plural of anecdote is data, right? But with respect, you are elderly, and I know some programs are specifically go out of their way to ask elderly people if they're being abused, because elder abuse is a subject. So it may well be that you were only asked because you're in your 80s, and that may have been the only reason you were asked at all.
Good point. I never thought about it. Maybe that's why. So getting back to the why don't we hear about it? One thing is where practitioners don't ask about it. And second, when they do ask about it, they only ask about assaults by men, not by women. And that applies, as I mentioned before, to researchers too. Those who've investigated children experiencing violence, almost all of them only ask about violence by the father, not about by the mother. So, as I said, we can't know about things that we don't seek to find out. And the other thing is, when we know about it, it's not just that we don't ask about it, but it is so often rejected. I've talked to social workers who work in child protection work, and I've asked them, what do they do in cases where the mother is violent as well as the father? And now, this is not a large sample. It's not even a sample. It's 4 that I could just happen to talk to. And every one of the 4 said, well, it must be self-defense. They just refuse to deal with it as a problem by itself. So that even when they know about it, they reject it as something that needs to be acted on.
And this gets to a question that I know Attila's probably got. Gunther was trying to get to it. We've sort of glanced at it. I sort of have my own answer, but what do we do Okay, you're an academic. So, of course, the whole world can't, you can't change the world. You're an academic. You present the research. The world does or does not act on your research. What can the rest of us do? I mean, I know what my answer is, which is to shout from the rooftops at every opportunity and as loudly as I can that this is a problem, and not care if it offends people. I've gotten to the point where I don't care who I'm offending. I'm going to say that this is truth and keep hammering it at them and make them listen. That seems to get some results, believe it or not. You wouldn't think being rude to people works, but surprisingly, sometimes it does, because it snaps them out of their comfortable place. But what else can we do?
Well,
there you go. What else can we do?
Well, each of us has to do what is feasible in our life situation. And I certainly agree with you that one of the most important things is to make this known bit by bit over time. It's a slow process. The prevailing ignorance and even worse, prevailing denial is going to be chipped away at, dissipated, and will prepare the way for programs and actions and prevention efforts that recognize the true situation. That is happening. It's happening very slowly, but it's happening. A main block is the distinction between the change which I see in the public recognition and what's happening in practice and policy. Public is more and more recognizing. In the back of their mind, they knew it was true anyhow, that this problem that has to be addressed by both, for women as well as men. The practitioners and the policymakers don't recognize that, and it's going to take a while before they do. Once the public is changed, then the laws and the practices are going to bit by bit change. I don't want to say we need to be patient, because I don't want to be patient, but unfortunately this is going to take a while. And you in your role as a journalist, me in my role as a researcher, people like Erin in her role as providing help and services, we're each of us making a contribution to it, though it's pretty frustrating to see how slow it is.
I believe that and I get accused of being a conspiracy nut, but that's just annoying, because it's not a conspiracy. I do think there is a great deal of corruption in a lot of so-called domestic violence research, because there's money to be made in this phony patriarchal model, and it props up a number of organizations that depend on it. And that seems to be the toughest nut of all to crack, because now it's not just ideological. You're a threat or perceived as a threat to the incomes of some people. Although I think that's unfortunate, because it doesn't have to be that way. If we developed effective treatment programs, well, we could long-term reduce the violence, but that would still be a multi-generational task. Attila, did you have another question or something else you wanted to say?
Who did you just, is that me you just?
Oh, Mr. Attila Winter. I'm sorry, he dropped off the line. I'm sorry, I thought he had more to say. And I guess that does get to my question, is Erin speaks of her success in helping people overcome their own violence. Sometimes keeping the relationship together, sometimes breaking up, but both parties going on to healthier relationships. Has anybody developed a formal program that can be taught to others that works along such lines?
Yeah, well, you see, the thing is, I did have a program. I had a whole therapeutic community, long-term residential care for people who had been savagely abused as children. And the reason it was closed down is because it exactly as Murray says, it was countering the view, the prevalent view, which is still prevalent, even though the people on the street and many people in these establishments know the truth now. You're asking, in a sense, Maria, in your field, there are a huge amount of master's degrees, PhD degrees, BAs, and all the rest that would have to be thrown out because most of them were actually passed erroneously because most of the information in so much of that work is wrong. Books, yes. The books are they'd have to be rewritten. Entire practice codes, which were trained by feminists to everybody, from the police to the judiciary, that would all have to be thrown out. You're going to have to deconstruct a huge empire. And always remember at the back of this, the woman who was, she was in charge of the big women's prisons in England, and she was a prison governor, and she actually said to me cynically, this is what the governors say, every child born into a dysfunctional family is a point on their pension pot. Now, can we remember that?
Yes. I have a child born into a dysfunctional family. What was the rest of what you said?
What I said was, she said that every child born into a dysfunctional family was a point on her pension. Oh. In other words, there is a vested interest in the establishment of all these agencies to keep the dysfunction flowing.
Yeah. Well, there are people like that, but I don't think there are very many. I think most people in agencies like that do want to help. They don't want to keep the cases flowing, even though their livelihood depends on it. That's just my personal values and opinion.
I think you're right, but you see, one of the things we have to think about, this truth has been known for a very long time, that it's nothing to do with the patriarchy and that it's not gendered. But across the domestic violence movement, it has been hugely resisted. Well, why? Why?
It's resisted because those people believe that that's in the best interest of everyone. That's their genuine belief, even though it's false.
You know, it would only take a small minority of people in power who have the cynical attitude that Erin does to spread the ideological wrongness that other people who genuinely want to help would just believe. Because, so, you know, you don't even have to have most people in this to have that cynical attitude. It only takes a small handful to have that small attitude, I would say.
And believe me, they're there.
Yeah, although they're getting older, and I've seen some real proof that in the younger generation, going into college or coming out of college now, you know, in graduate programs, Don Dutton even said he's seeing in his students in their 20s, he's seeing, and most of them are women, he's seeing a lot more open-mindedness to what Professor Straus talks about and others, about how it's not a gendered issue. So I do take the professor's point that it's going to take time, but I suspect that some of these ideologues, as the gray hairs retire, we might start seeing some things change. Now, I'm soapboxing enough, I suppose, but we've been going for 90 minutes now, so we should probably get it wrapped up. I'm sure you're getting tired, Professor. Allison, you had a closing question or remark?
Well, I think that the patriarchal model is a comfortable place for people to inhabit mentally. And the reason why is because we view women as being acted upon. We view them in the class of being acted upon, and we view men as actors. And it's just sort of an emotional attitude that we have. So we look for how women are victims. And when men are obviously victims, we look to try to reframe it as them acting, and therefore we place blame on them. And that's sort of our comfort zone, I think, when we look at human interactions, and I think that applies to domestic violence as much as anywhere else. And the only problem, I would say, is that these ideologues who are promoting this model based on that and appealing to that is, if you appeal to that, you enforce it. So don't turn around and say, women are acted upon, women are acted upon, women are acted... Oh, wait, they can be presidents and soldiers. It doesn't work like that. If you want to push the idea that women can be anything that men can do, anything that men can do, you can't push, and one side of your mouth say that, and the other side of your mouth constantly focus and emphasize and promote this idea that women are acted upon, that women are obviously victims whenever they're in an interaction with men, and men cannot be victims of women because it's almost like a taboo. It's like something we can't even conceive of. A man being acted upon by a woman? Oh my goodness. The world is going to implode. So I'll just put that out there. My concluding remark.
It is a good remark. I take your point, and I tend to agree with it. We do seem more comfortable thinking of women as acted upon rather than being actors in their own right. And that puts... Well, Warren Farrell has said it, too. A woman's strength is the illusion of her weakness, and a man's weakness is his illusion of strength. I think there's a real truth to that observation. This patriarchal model, which is false, not only puts men who are truly not able to help themselves in just a horrible strait, but what does it say to women? I mean, Erin, I think you said this. You find it you still told me you find it bloody condescending, haven't you?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I always have. And I toured America, and I remember standing on these platforms and saying to these huge audiences, again, mostly of women, I can't be the only woman that takes responsibility for my own violent behavior. And there'd be a dead silence, and nobody'd say anything. The fact is that it's absolutely fine. Both men and women are capable of evil. Both of us are capable of things that we do that we're ashamed of. But you cannot be ashamed if you were born into a violent, warring family if you don't learn loving, peaceful strategies, because how are you supposed to learn if nobody's around to teach you? And mothering and fathering are taught. They're not innate in people. And we don't give people a second chance in this society. What we do is we imprison men, and the way they punish women, certainly in England, because I'm the one there fighting it, is to take away any child she has if she is deemed an unfit mother. Well, how is she supposed to mother if nobody's mothered her? My argument is we need to start at the beginning. Mother and father and parent, people who have never had a chance to learn.
Okay, well, I'd like to start wrapping up the show. I want to very much thank Professor Straus for joining us. I hope we can talk him into joining us again sometime. I want to remind everybody that his current book is called The Primordial Violence from Routledge Publisher. Routledge is the publisher, I mean. And you can find, if you just Google Murray Straus, you'll find his page on the University of New Hampshire, which has hundreds of papers on it, which I haven't read them all, but I've read a few. And he's a pioneering and important researcher. Dr. Straus, would you like to... Is there anything else you'd like to say or a parting message you'd like to give to the audience?
Yes, I'd like to just end with something that I've said several times. It's so blatantly obvious that it seems silly to emphasize it, but this is one of those obvious truths that everyone knows about and disregards, namely that partner violence, like almost everything else, has multiple causes. And if you attend to just one of them, probability of not being very successful is great. Each part of it needs to be attended to, and that requires a team effort. We haven't had that. We need to have it organized to deal with partner violence. So it's, as I said, a very simple principle, but it's not just the people who are ideologues for the patriarchy explanation. It's almost everyone else. They think that the aspect that they're working on, they act as though it's the only important one. Well, it is important, but they need to keep in mind, constantly remind themselves that there are almost certainly other things going on as well.
Fair enough. And I said I'd give you the last word, but I'm going to make one more observation. It's the same one I've made for a few others. One thing that consistently frustrates me is that it's 2014. By now, it's shocking to me that by now, at this point, it's anything that we have said in this conversation, anything that Professor Straus just said, the idea that it's controversial. I'm 47 years old, and I still never fail to be astounded that anybody thinks that what he's saying is controversial. I think that'll do it for us this week. Join us again next week at this same time zone for Tales from the Infrared, which is our show on geek culture. Erin and I will be back here again in 2 weeks. Erin will be calling from London. Say good night to everybody, Erin.
Good night, everybody, and thank you so much, Murray. It was lovely to talk with you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.
James, take us home, please.
You have been listening to Revelations with Erin Pizzey and her co-host, Dean Esme. Our show's opening music is called Eternal Hope, and the closing piece is called Sunshine. Both pieces are by Kevin MacLeod and are used under the Creative Commons Attribution License, with a link in the show notes. We also wish to thank James Huff and Paul Elam, and indeed all those who are part of the A Voice for Men community for their support for this show. Remember, in truth there is hope and healing, and we hope that you will be part of helping to spread the truth and the healing. Please join us next time in Revelations with Erin Pizzey.